My father mocked me in front of everyone until my husband whispered something in his ear. And in that instant, the world as I knew it shattered. The air in our Newport Beach home was thick with the scent of gardenias and expensive champagne. From the outside, I was Rachel Torres, the woman who had it all. A career as a cardiovascular surgeon that I'd clawed my way to, a home with a view of the Pacific that I'd bought myself, and a husband, Derek, whose quiet strength was my anchor. It was the perfect picture, meticulously painted over years of trying to prove I was worthy. But in every perfect picture, there's a shadow. My shadow had a name, Dad. It was my birthday party. 50 of our closest friends and colleagues were scattered around our living room, their laughter echoing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. That's when my father, Thomas Torres, decided to give his toast. He raised his glass, a cruel little smirk playing on his lips, and his voice boomed over the music. "To my little girl, Rachel," he began, and I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. Still playing doctor. It's a cute little life she's built, isn't it? Of course, if it weren't for her husband footing the bill for this lifestyle, she'd still be drowning in student loans. The conversations died. I could feel every eye on me, my face burning with a shame so familiar it felt like a second skin. But before I could even find my voice, something different happened. Derek didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He simply placed his hand on my back, a silent promise, and walked calmly toward my father. He leaned in, his mouth close to my father's ear, and whispered something I couldn't. I watched as the blood my father's his wine glass started to tremble. The crystal, he stammered, his voice a choked whisper that only I could see. You. Derek just gave him a small, cold smile and walked back to me. My father, the man who had never been silenced in his life, was broken by a single sentence, and I had no idea what it was. But I was about to find out This is the story of how that one whisper unraveled a lifetime. It's a long and painful story, and I'll need a friend to see it through. To be sure you hear how it all ends, you can follow the stories told here. That way, you won't miss the next part. The party ended not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, awkward goodbyes. Friends who normally would have lingered for one last drink suddenly remembered early morning meetings. They'd shoot me a sympathetic glance, a quick hug, and then hurry out the door, escaping the tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. When the last car pulled away, the silence in our beautiful home was deafening. I turned to Derek, the question burning on my lips. "What did you say to him?" He just pulled me into his arms, his chin resting on the top of my head. He told me it was nothing, just a reminder of some old business they'd discussed. He said my father had crossed a line, and he'd made it clear it wouldn't happen again. "It's handled, Rachel," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I promise. You don't have to worry about him anymore. And because I loved him, because I trusted him more than anyone, I chose to believe. I wanted to believe." For a couple of days, I let the relief wash over the memory of my father's face, pale, shocked, and for the first time in my life, scared, was a balm on a lifetime of wounds. I replayed it in my mind. A seek to explain what it's like to spend your life chasing the approval of someone who only seems to enjoy watching you stumble. When I graduated from medical school, my father told our relatives it was a shame I'd have to work such long hours. I'd never find a husband that way. When I bought this house, he walked through the empty rooms and remarked that it was a lot of house for a single girl to be rattling around in, as if my success was just a placeholder for failure. Every achievement was twisted into a criticism, a backhanded reminder that I was, in his eyes, less than. So, seeing him silenced, seeing him actually put in his place, felt like I thought Derek had just given me a gift, a final, definitive shutdown of my father's cruelty. I thought it was over, but it wasn't. The first crack in that perfect, simple story appeared 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd just gotten home from a 12-hour shift, my feet aching and my mind numb from the intensity of the OR. I was sorting through the mail on the kitchen island, bills, catalogs, the usual junk, when I saw it. A thick, cream-colored envelope made of heavy, expensive paper. It was addressed to Derek. What was unusual was the return address. In crisp, black embossed lettering, it read, Torres Holdings Oversight Group. Torres. My blood went cold. It wasn't my father's company logo. I knew that one by heart. This was something else, something cold and corporate and final sounding. My hands trembled slightly as I held the envelope. My first instinct was to put it on Derek's desk and forget I ever saw it. He told me it was handled. I should trust him. but I'm a surgeon. My entire life is built on looking past the surface, on finding the tiny, imperceptible anomaly that signals a much bigger problem. I couldn't ignore this. I didn't open it. I would never do that. But I took out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen as I typed the company name into a search engine. The results were sparse. A corporate registration filed in Delaware. A list of managing partners I didn't recognize. It was all legal jargon, deliberately vague. But then I saw it, buried in the fine print of a business directory listing, a description of their services. Specializing in leveraged buyouts, debt acquisition, and hostile restructuring. Debt acquisition. Hostile restructuring. I looked from the glowing screen of my phone to the heavy envelope in my... He hadn't just reminded my father of some old business. He hadn't just had a stern conversation. Those words, acquisition, restructuring, they were words of financial warfare. My husband, the man I loved, the man who I thought had simply defended my few well-chosen words, was involved in something far more calculated. He told me not to worry. He told me it was handled. But holding that envelope, with my family's name printed next to words that screamed of corporate takeover, I realized Derek hadn't just ended an argument. He had launched a campaign, and I was completely in the dark. I placed the envelope on Derek's desk, right where he'd see it, and said nothing. For the next 2 days, I lived in a state of quiet, agonizing suspense. I watched him pick it up, his expression unreadable as he scanned the return address. He didn't mention it. He just tucked it into his briefcase and went about his day. I'd ask him how his day was, and he'd tell me about meetings and market fluctuations. The same calm, steady Derek he'd always been. Chasm was opening between us. A silent space he wasn't. We once shaped by a brittle I was a terrible actress. I knew he could sense something was off and push. It was like we were both waiting to see who would break the silence first. The opportunity came on Thursday evening. Over dinner, he told me he had to fly to New York for a couple of days. A last-minute deal with a client was heating up. He said it so casually, right between asking if I wanted more wine and talking about a movie he wanted to see. But I saw the flicker in his eyes, a brief moment of guardedness that wasn't there before. Client. The lie was so simple, so plausible, it felt like a slap in the face. I nodded, smiled, told him to be safe. Every part of me wanted to scream, to demand the truth. But another, colder part of me, the surgeon, knew that a premature incision could cause the patient to bleed out. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I started cutting. The next morning, the moment the front door clicked shut behind him, the house felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a crime scene, and I was the detective. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked to his home office. The door was closed. He never closed. I stood there for a long moment, my hand hovering over the cool metal of the doorknob. This felt like a fundamental betrayal of his trust, of our trust. This was the man who held my hand for 3 hours in the hospital waiting room when my intern made a critical mistake and I was under review. The man who learned to make my grandmother's chicken soup because he knew it was the only thing that made me feel better after a patient was lost. Was I about to blow up my entire life? But then I thought of my father's trembling, of the words debt acquisition on my phone screen. I had to know. I opened the door. His office was, as always, immaculate. The only thing on his large oak desk was his laptop. I sat in his leather chair, the scent of his cologne still lingering in the air, and opened it. The login screen appeared, asking for a password. Of course. I tried the obvious ones. Our anniversary, my birthday, the name of the boat he loved. Access denied. Access denied. Access denied. My frustration grew. I was about to give up when I remembered a conversation we'd had years ago on one of our first dates. He told me the moment he knew he'd make it in finance was when he shorted a biotech stock everyone else was betting on. He called it his Genesis. I remembered him laughing. With trembling fingers, I typed in the 4-letter code. Access grant. My breath. I was in. I navigated to his documents, my eyes scanning the folders. Financials. Investments. Household. And then I saw it. A folder named simply TT Project. My father's initials, Thomas Torres. My blood ran cold. I clicked on it. It was like staring into an abyss. There were dozens of files, spreadsheets, scanned legal notices, loan agreements. I opened one. It was a summary of outstanding debts for Torres Construction, my father's company. I scrolled down, my eyes widening in horror. The numbers were staggering. more than I could have possibly imagined. And it wasn't just bank loans. There were markers from casinos in Atlantic City, high-interest loans from private lenders with predatory reputations. My father hadn't just made a few bad investments. He had gambled and borrowed his entire empire into his life, his success, the foundation of his arrogance. It was all a house of cards. But that wasn't the proof. It was just the motive. The real punch to the gut came when I opened a file labeled Acquisition Summary. It was a detailed timeline showing how Torres Holdings Oversight Group, Derek's shell company, had been systematically, ruthlessly buying up every single dollar of that debt over the past 6 months. He'd been doing it in secret, for pennies on the dollar, collecting the strings of my father's ruin. The whisper at my party wasn't a spontaneous defense. It was a calculated move by someone who already held all the power. My father hadn't just lied about his money, he'd lied about his entire identity. But the realization that stole the air from my lungs was about my husband. The quiet, supportive man I married was capable of this. This cold, strategic demolition of another man's life. He wasn't just my defender. He was a shark who had been circling for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I had been sleeping next to him every night, completely unaware. I sat there in the silence of Derek's office, the glow of the laptop screen painting my face in a cold blue light. For a moment I couldn't. My mind was a maelstrom of numbers and legal terms, of betrayal and a strange, hollow pity for my father. I thought I had found the bottom. I was wrong. The well of secrets was far deeper than I could have imagined. Driven by a terrible, compulsive need to see it all, I kept clicking. If my life was built on a lie, I wanted to see the architecture of it. I found a subfolder inside the TT Project directory, cryptically labeled Phase 2. The contents made the financial documents look like child's play. It wasn't about money anymore. This was about annihilation. The first file I opened was an inventory, not just of company assets, but of everything my father owned, everything that had personal, sentimental value. I saw the 1967 Mustang he spent every Saturday of my teenage years restoring in the garage, the smell of grease and polish a core memory of my youth. It was there, with a current market appraisal. I saw the small, rustic cabin in the San Bernardino Mountains where he taught me how to fish, the only place he ever seemed to drop his armor and just be a dad. It was listed, complete with property records and a valuation for a quick sale. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a scanned list of the contents of his personal safe. It included my grandmother's a string of pearls and a sapphire ring that he was meant to be holding for me. Derek had hired a private appraiser for them. He had put a price on my heritage. Drafts of auction listings were attached to each item. The plan wasn't just to take his company, it was to systematically strip mine his life, selling off every piece of his past, every tangible memory, until nothing was left. But the final, most chilling document was in a folder marked Communications. It was a prepared press release drafted by a high-powered PR firm in Los Angeles. The headline was devastating. Thomas Torres, Newport Beach developer, faces company collapse amid allegations of fiscal mismanagement and tax fraud. It was a professional execution, a document designed to ruin his name, his reputation, everything he had built his arrogant identity upon. It detailed his gambling debts, hinted at offshore accounts, and framed him as a failed, corrupt businessman. The scariest part? The date on the draft. It was dated for the week following my birthday party. My public humiliation wasn't the event that triggered Derek's plan. It was meant to be the opening act, the first crack in the facade before Derek brought the whole building down on his head for the world to see. He was going to let my father expose his cruelty, only to then expose my father as a fraud to everyone. I finally pushed back from the desk, a wave of nausea washing over me. I stumbled out of the office, closing the door behind me, and leaned against the wall in the hallway, my hand covering my mouth. It was too much. It was too cruel. My father was a difficult, often hurtful man who had wounded me in ways I was still recovering from. But this was a public stoning. This was a complete demolition of a human being, orchestrated in secret by my own husband. I looked at the photos on our hallway table, one of me and my father when I was a kid, sitting on his shoulders at a 4th of July parade. One of me and Derek on our wedding day, his smile so genuine, his eyes so full of what I thought was uncomplicated love. I was caught between two men, a father who hurt me with his words, and a husband who was planning to destroy him with his actions. And I was just the excuse, the justification for it all. Staring at the photo of that little girl, the one who just wanted her dad to be proud of her, I felt the last of my shock curdle into something else. It was a cold, hard resolve that settled deep in my bones. The sadness was gone, replaced by a clarity I hadn't felt in days. My father had treated me like a disappointment. My husband was treating me like a damsel in distress who needed avenging. They had both made a critical mistake. They thought this was their story. They were about to find out it was mine. When Derek came home that Saturday, I had already rehearsed my role 100 times. I was the loving wife, happy to have her husband back. I greeted him at the door with a kiss that felt like a lie on my lips. He handed me a small, beautifully wrapped box from a boutique in Soho, a delicate silver bracelet. The cold weight of it on my wrist felt like a shackle. I told him it was beautiful. I told him I missed him. I played the part, and either he didn't notice the hollowness in my voice, or he was too busy playing his own role to care. We settled into our weekend routine, the familiar rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. We made dinner together, moving around the kitchen in a dance we knew by heart. It was terrifying how normal it felt. This was the man I loved. This was the life we had built. And beneath it all, the truth was a venomous snake, coiled and waiting. I had to know more, but I knew a direct confrontation would be a disaster. He would just build his walls higher. So, I laid a trap, using the one person he thought he was protecting me from as bait. While we were eating, I let out a small, deliberate sigh. I told him my father had called earlier in the day. This was a lie. I hadn't spoken to my father since the party. I said he sounded lost. I watched Derek's face for a reaction. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His touch meant to be reassuring. He told me, his voice low and soothing, that I just needed to hold on a little longer. He said he knew it was hard, but he was taking care of everything. And then he made his mistake. He must have felt so confident, so sure of my ignorance, that a little bit of his arrogance slipped through. He told me not to worry about my dad because pretty soon he wouldn't be in any position to bother anyone ever again. He said that was especially true once the Henderson deal was made public. Henderson. The name hung in the air between us, completely meaningless to the woman I was pretending to be. I just nodded, feigning a tired confusion, and said I trusted him. I let him believe his reassurance had worked. I let him believe I was the same naive wife he'd left 2 days ago. We finished dinner, we watched a movie, and all the while, the name Henderson was screaming in my head. It was a key, a loose thread on his perfectly woven tapestry of secrets, and he had handed it to me himself. Later that night, I lay in bed, be asleep. I could feel the warmth of his body next to mine, the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was the most loneliness I have ever felt, to be so close to the person you share your life, only to realize you don't know them at all. I waited, my own breathing measured and even, until I was sure he was sound asleep. Then, I carefully slipped out of bed. In the faint light of the living room, I opened my own laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I started with simple searches. Henderson, Newport Beach. Henderson Real Estate. Nothing. Then I tried Henderson and the name of Derek's investment firm. And there it was. Henderson Global Partners. A massive, notoriously aggressive private equity firm. They were known for buying distressed companies, gutting them for assets, and selling the scraps. They were corporate vultures. And a news release from last month announced a new strategic partnership with Derek's firm, aimed at exploring opportunities in the West Coast construction sector. My blood turned to ice. The Henderson deal wasn't just a part of the plan, it was the end game. Derek wasn't just taking over my father's debt to control him. He was packaging the entire company, my father's name, his life's work, to be sold to the highest bidder, to a firm that would strip it for parts and destroy the lives of his hundreds of employees. He thought Henderson was just a meaningless name he'd let slip in a moment. His clueless wife. He had no idea he'd just given me the full name of my father's ex. Derek had given me a weapon. Knowing the name of the executioner wasn't enough. I needed to know why. Why this specific firm, Henderson Global? And why the sheer, unadulterated viciousness from Derek? This felt like more than just a defense of a wronged wife. It felt personal. It was an obsession, humming just beneath the surface of the man I thought I knew. My investigation had to change. I wasn't just looking at the present anymore. I had to dig up the past. For the next week, I lived a double life. By day, I was Dr. Torres, focused and precise in the operating room. By night, after Derek was asleep, I descended into a rabbit hole of digital archives, old business journals, and court filings. I searched for any connection between my father and Henderson Global, but it was a dead end. They had no public history. Then, I changed tactics. I started searching for lawsuits or major business disputes connected to Torres Construction, going back decades. It was a tedious, soul-crushing process. Page after page of legal jargon, zoning disputes, and contractor disagreements. I almost gave up. Then, I found it. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a human interest piece in an old defunct Orange County business journal from nearly 20 years ago. The headline was unassuming, "Local developer stumbles as Goliath moves in." The Goliath was my father, Thomas Torres. The article detailed how he had won a massive, career-making bid to develop a new suburban, but it focused on the company that lost, the small, family-run firm that was driven into bankruptcy by the loss. Whitmore and Son Development. Whitmore. My heart stopped. I read the words over and over, a roaring in my ears that drowned out the silence of the house. The article painted a damning picture of my father's tactics, how he'd poached Whitmore's lead engineer with a massive offer just weeks before the final bid, how he'd started a quiet smear campaign, spreading rumors to investors that Whitmore and Son was financially unstable. It was a textbook corporate assassination. The article included a grainy black and white photo. A grim-faced, middle-aged man, the elder Mr. Whitmore, was nailing a closed sign to the door of his office. And standing next to him, his shoulders slumped in defeat, but his eyes burning with a silent fury, was his son. A much younger, leaner version of my husband, Derek. The laptop nearly slipped from my grasp. This was never about me. Not really. I was just a pawn in a game that had started before I even knew Derek existed. My father hadn't just insulted my career at a birthday party. He had destroyed Derek's family, he had ruined his father, stolen his inheritance, and erased his future. And Derek had spent the last 20 years plotting his revenge. My mind raced, replaying my entire relationship in a sickening new light. Our chance meeting at that charity gala, in a setup, his intense interest in which I'd mistaken for caring, was it just reconnaissance? All those questions about my father's business, his moods, his weaknesses. He wasn't just making conversation, he was gathering intelligence. The man I had fallen in love with, the man whose proposal I'd accepted on a moonlit, had he been looking at me and seeing not a unwitting, the pain was sharp, physical than aims. To think that the love I had one safe harbor in my life might have been nothing more than it broke me in a way my father's lifelong. I closed the laptop. The face of that young, furious Derek burned into my memory. I crept back into bed, lying on the very edge, as far from him as I could get. He stirred in his sleep, murmuring something and reaching flinched. For a moment, I wanted to shatter the silence, to scream at him, to demand to know if any of it was real. But I swallowed the rage, letting the ice form in my veins instead. He had been playing chess. My father had been playing checkers. But they both thought I was just a piece on the board. I stared at the dark sea, terrible, devastating truth giving me a clarity I'd never had before. This wasn't just about my father's company or Derek's revenge anymore. This was about my life. A life that I was for the first time going to take complete control of. The knowledge of Derek's true motive was a poison. It seeped into every interaction, every shared meal, every quiet moment in our home. I was living with the architect of my father's and, potentially, the architect of my own heartbreak. The weight of it all was but I knew that emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford. A surgeon doesn't get to panic in the middle of a complex procedure. They get methodical. They identify the problem, and they formulate a plan. I had the diagnosis. Now I needed the instruments. I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who understood the world Derek operated, someone whose loyalty was beyond question. My mind went to Chloe, roommate from college. We'd spent countless nights cramming for exams, me for organic chemistry, law. While I'd gone to med school, she'd climbed the ranks to become a partner at a top corporate law firm. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but I knew if there was one person who could look at this mess with a clear, strategic eye, it was her. Setting up the meeting required a level of paranoia that was becoming my new normal. I told Derek I was attending a one-day seminar on a new cardiothoracic technique at UCLA. I booked the conference online with a prepaid credit card. The morning of, I drove to LA, my stomach in knots, checking my rearview mirror constantly. Insane, like something out of a movie, but the fear was very real. Chloe's office was on the 40th floor of a glass tower that scraped the sky. It was a world of quiet power, a universe away from my messy, emotional reality. When I finally sat across from her at a large mahogany desk, I almost lost my nerve. She looked at me, her expression full of concern, and asked what was wrong. I took a deep breath and laid out the abridged version. I told her I'd discovered a secret, hostile takeover of my father's business, orchestrated by my husband. I didn't mention the decades-old revenge plot, I didn't mention the photo in the newspaper, or the sickening possibility that my marriage was a lie. I framed it as a legal problem. I handed her a secure thumb drive containing the key documents I had copied from Derek's laptop. She spent the next hour in silence, her eyes scanning the files, her expression hardening with a kind of professional respect. When she finally looked up, her words made my blood run cold. She told me that, from what she could see, Derek's plan was a masterpiece of legal aggression. It was brutal, it was unethical, but it was almost certainly airtight. Buying distressed debt on the open market was legal. Using that leverage to force a restructuring was legal. He had insulated himself perfectly. Every I was dotted, every T was crossed. For a moment, I felt the air leave my lungs. There was no way out. But then she paused, tapping a long, manicured finger on one of the documents on her screen. It was a prospectus for the Henderson Global sale. She said that while Derek's plan to acquire the company was perfect, the plan to sell it had a potential flaw. She explained that the value of my father's company wasn't just in its buildings or equipment, it was in the land it owned, and more specifically, the permits attached to that land. The Henderson deal, she pointed out, was contingent on the validity of all existing zoning and development permits. She scrolled deep into the document to an appendix buried on page 87. It was a reference to Permit Z749, a zoning variance my father had secured back in 2005 for a massive undeveloped tract of land. It was the crown jewel of his portfolio. Chloe explained that permits like that, especially ones from that era, were often pushed through with handshake deals and political favors. There was a chance, a very small chance, that the paperwork wasn't entirely clean. If that permit could be challenged, if it was proven invalid, the land would be worth a fraction of its appraised value. The Henderson deal would stall, maybe even collapse. Derek's checkmate would be nothing more than a bluff. And he was staggering. My father's own history of cutting corners and bending rules, the very arrogance that had fueled his rise, might be the only thing that could save him. Chloe told me it was a long shot, that challenging a permit that old was incredibly difficult. But it was a shot. She gave me the name of a forensic accounting firm that specialized in real estate and a private investigator who owed her a favor. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a victim. I left her office with a target, a name, a number, Permit Z749. I had my instrument. Now, it was time to make the first incision. Armed with a name and a permit number, I made the call. The investigator Chloe had recommended, a man named Miller, had a voice that was low, gravelly, and utterly devoid of emotion. He was perfect. I hired him, wiring the funds from a new bank account I'd opened under my maiden name. Then came the hardest part, the waiting. For 2 weeks, I lived on a knife's edge. At home, I was the dutiful, loving wife, listening to Derek talk about his work, feigning interest, all while a silent scream was building inside me. He was more relaxed now, more confident, like a predator that knows its prey is cornered. The condescending affection he showed me was almost unbearable, but I held onto my mask. It was my only armor. Every day I expected a call from Miller. Every time my phone buzzed with an unknown number, my heart would leap into my throat. I was in surgery, suturing a bypass graft, when the call finally came. I finished the procedure with hands that felt steady, but were electric with adrenaline. As soon as I was out of the OR, I found an empty on-call room and dialed him back. Miller's voice was as calm as ever, but his words were a bombshell. He had found it. He told me that Permit Z749 had been approved based on a geological survey that was a complete fabrication. He'd tracked down the retired geologist whose name was on the original filing. The man, now in his late 70s and eager to clear his conscience, had given Miller a sworn affidavit. He confirmed that his original report showed the land was too unstable for the proposed development due to seismic risks. He stated under oath that my father had offered him a substantial sum of money to bury that report and sign off on a forged one. Miller had copies of both the original, buried report and the fraudulent one that went to the county. It was a smoking gun. The permit wasn't just flawed, It was built on a felony. I held the phone to my ear, a wave of dizzying power washing over me. This document wasn't just leverage, it was a nuke. It could not only scuttle the Henderson deal, but could also potentially open my father up to criminal charges. I now had the power to ruin both of them. The question was no longer if I could act, but how and when. The answer, ironically, came from Derek himself. A few nights later, he came home buzzing with an energy I hadn't seen in him before. It was the thrill of victory. He told me the final details of a major acquisition were being ironed out. To celebrate, he was hosting an intimate dinner for the executive team from Henderson Global. It would be in a private room at an exclusive restaurant in Pelican Hill, a place where deals worth billions were signed over dessert. He asked me to be there. He said he wanted his partners to meet the brilliant, beautiful woman he was doing all this for. He was casting me as his trophy, the justification for his conquest. He was, in his supreme arrogance, inviting me to sit at the table where he would feast on the bones of my father's legacy. It was the perfect stage. Not a boardroom, not our home, but a semi-public space filled with the very people whose trust and capital were the foundation of his entire plan. In that room, his reputation would be everything. The slightest crack in his composure, the slightest hint of scandal, would be catastrophic. That night, I stood in front of my closet, my hand hovering over a blue dress he always loved. I saw my reflection in the mirror. The woman who had flinched and burned with shame at her own birthday party was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized. Her eyes were cold, her expression was calm. She was a surgeon about to perform the most difficult and necessary operation of her life. Derek thought he was planning a celebration. He had no idea I was planning a reckoning. The next evening, when he asked if I was ready to go, I turned from the mirror wearing that blue dress and gave him the most brilliant, genuine smile I could muster. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and I knew my lines by heart. The day of the dinner, our house was unnervingly quiet. It was the kind of charged silence that precedes a storm. Derek was electric, moving through the rooms with the confident swagger of a king on his coronation. He talked about the future, about a long vacation in the Maldives, about finally being free from certain obligations. I just smiled and nodded, a perfect porcelain doll of a wife. Inside, I was a surgeon preparing for a life-or-death operation. I spent an hour that morning in my study, arranging the papers Miller had sent. I selected the 3 most damning pages: the sworn affidavit from the geologist, a side-by-side comparison of the real and forged survey maps, and a summary page Chloe had helped me draft, highlighting the legal ramifications. I slipped them into a slim, unassuming leather folder. It was so thin, so light, yet it held the weight of 2 men's worlds. Later, I told Derek I needed some air and walked down to the beach. The fog was rolling in off the Pacific, muffling the sound of the world. I stood at the edge of the water, letting the cold spray mist my face. First time I let myself feel the grieved for the man I thought I had. Quiet, still, who held me after long shifts and made me feel safe. Or was I just a ghost in his long-form revenge was about to die? Is still a loss. Even when, as I walked back toward the house, my moment of quiet reflection was shattered. A familiar car was parked haphazardly in our driveway. My father, he practically stumbled out of the driver's side, his face pale and haggard. He hadn't come to see me. He was shouting Derek's name. I slipped in through a side door and watched from the living room window, my heart hammering against my ribs. Derek came out to meet him, his posture rigid with annoyance. I couldn't hear their words, but I didn't need to. Body language is its own conversation. My father was pleading, his hands outstretched, his movements jerky and desperate. He looked small, old, and utterly terrified. Derek, by contrast, was a statue of ice. He stood perfectly still, his hands in his pockets, listening with an expression of pure, unadulterated. The man who had terrorized me my entire life was now begging for mercy. Then I saw my father do something I never thought possible. He crumbled. His shoulders sagged and he seemed to shrink. In a final, pathetic act of desperation, he reached out and shoved Derek in the chest. It was a weak, clumsy push, the gesture of a drowning man. Derek didn't even flinch. He just looked down at where my father's hand had touched his suit, then back up at his face, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. He said one last thing at his back and walked back inside, leaving my father standing alone in the driveway, a man utterly broken. In that moment, any lingering pity, Any shred of doubt I had evaporated. This was not a fight between a villain and a hero. It was a war between two monsters, and I was caught in the crossfire. No more. The ride to the restaurant was silent. Derek reached over and took my hand, telling me he was proud of how I'd handled the stress with my father lately. I squeezed his hand back, the leather folder in my purse on the seat between us. The lights of Pelican Hill glittered ahead of us, a false constellation of wealth and power. The valet opened my door. Derek came around and put his hand on the small of my back, a familiar, proprietary gesture to guide me inside. He was beaming, ready for his victory lap. He thought he was leading me to his coronation. He had no idea he was walking into a trial and that I was the judge, the jury, and the star witness. The private dining room at the Pelican Grill was a bubble of immense power. The air was heavy with the scent of leather, aged wine, and the low, confident hum of men who measured their worth in billions. There were 3 of them from Henderson Global, led by a silver-haired man named Marcus Davies, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Derek was radiant, a star in his own orbit, charming them with anecdotes and projections. He introduced me, and I was the perfect smiling wife, my hand resting calmly on his arm while my heart beat a steady, surgical rhythm. I played my part through the appetizers and the main course, a silent observer in my own life. The moment I had been waiting for arrived with the espresso. Derek raised his glass for a final toast. He spoke of a new era of partnership, of vision, and of the successful acquisition of a valuable but mismanaged asset. He looked right at me as he said it, a glint of ownership in his eyes. The Henderson men raised their glasses, their smiles sharp and predatory. This was his summit, the absolute peak of his 20-year climb. As they set their glasses down, Mr. Davies leaned back, a satisfied look on his face. He told Derek the due diligence his team had provided on the Torres portfolio was impeccable. He said the real value, the thing that made the deal irresistible, was the land. That was my cue. I cleared my throat softly, just enough to draw their attention. "Forgive me for interrupting," I began, my voice even and calm. I saw a flash of annoyance in Derek's eyes, quickly masked by a forced, indulgent smile. "I couldn't help but overhear you talking about my family's company," I continued, my gaze fixed not on my husband, but on Marcus Davies. "As a surgeon, I have a deep appreciation for due diligence. It's a matter of life and death in my profession, and I'm afraid there's one piece of data, one crucial part of the patient's history, that seems to be missing from your file." I reached into my purse and placed the slim leather folder on the crisp white tablecloth. The sound was almost imperceptible, but in the suddenly silent room, it felt like a gavel. Derek's smile vanished. He started to speak, to dismiss me, telling the table that I was simply under a lot of emotional strain. I ignored him completely, my eyes still locked with Davies. I opened the folder and slid the first page across the polished wood of the table. "This," I said, my voice as precise as a scalpel, "is a sworn affidavit from the chief geologist on the original survey for the largest land parcel in that portfolio, the parcel tied to permit Z749. Davies picked it up. The other 2 partners leaned in to read over his shoulder. I saw their eyebrows raise. Derek, his face now pale, tried again, his voice tight with rage. He told me this was wildly inappropriate. "And this," I said, sliding out the next 2 pages, "is his original report, the one he was paid to bury, showing the land is geologically unfit for development." I pointed to the map. "And this is the fraudulent document that was submitted to the county. Forgery, bribery, fraud. I believe those are the correct terms." The atmosphere in the room, the warmth of celebration had been replaced by a glacial chill. The Henderson partners weren't looking at me. They were all staring at Derek. Their expressions were not of disappointment, but of cold, professional fury. They were sharks who had just smelled bad blood in the water, and it was coming from their own partner. "The land isn't an asset, Mr. Davies," I stated, my voice clinical. "It's a toxic liability. The permit is void. The valuation of your entire deal is based on a fiction." Finally, I turned my head and looked at my husband. The mask of the triumphant victor was gone, replaced by the face of the boy in the newspaper photograph, full of shock and incandescent rage. I let him see the knowledge in my eyes. "It's over, Derek," I said, my voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. I turned back to the Henderson partners. "You should also know that this entire acquisition was never about sound financial strategy. It was a 20-year-old personal vendetta. Mr. Whitmore's father was driven into bankruptcy by my father. He married me to get his revenge. I let that sink in, letting them fully grasp that they had bet millions on the emotional crusade of an unstable, compromised man. I stood up, my movements fluid and unhurried. The silence in the room was absolute. Mr. Davies was holding the affidavit, his knuckles white. Derek was frozen, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated. He had been so focused on my father, that he had never once considered the woman standing right next to him. I placed my napkin gently on the table. "Now, if you'll excuse," I said to the room at large. And then I turned and walked out, leaving him in the ruins of his perfect, calculated world. I didn't look back. I walked out of that restaurant, past the concerned face of the maitre d', and into the cool night air. I didn't get in the car Derek and I had arrived in. My own car, which I had parked in a public lot down the street that afternoon, was my escape pod. I drove away from the glittering lights of Pelican Hill, not toward the beautiful house that had become a prison, but south, down the Pacific Coast Highway. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel happy. I felt quiet. It was the vast, silent emptiness of a battlefield after the war is over, the adrenaline drained out of me, leaving behind a profound stillness. I checked into a small, anonymous hotel, locked the door, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. The fallout came in waves, reported to me in clipped professional updates from Chloe. The Henderson deal hadn't just stalled, it had spectacularly imploded. As predicted, they had filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Derek's firm for fraud and misrepresentation. His partners, furious at the reputational and financial damage, forced him out. His career, the one he had meticulously built on a foundation of cold calculation, was over. He tried to reach me, of course. A flood of voicemails, each one escalating from confusion to pleading to a venomous spitting rage. I listened to the first one, then deleted the rest without hearing them. I blocked his number and had Chloe's office serve him the divorce papers the following. He never saw me again. My father's end was quieter, but no less absolute. Without Derek propping up his debts, his company collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. The creditors took everything. The house I grew up in, the company, the vintage Mustang, all of it was liquidated. The threat of criminal charges for the fraudulent permit still looms, a final, pathetic cloud over his head. About 6 months later, he showed up at the door of the new apartment I'd rented, a smaller place closer to the hospital that was entirely mine. I almost didn't recognize him. The booming, arrogant man who had dominated every room he ever entered was gone. His place was a stooped, gray-faced old man in a cheap suit. He tried to talk to me. Something about making mistakes, about family. He wasn't apologizing, he was just broken. I listened for a moment, and what I felt was the most surprising thing of all. No anger, no pity, no lingering love. The hole he had carved inside me over a lifetime no longer had any power. I told him I had nothing to say and then, in the quiet months that followed, the final truth of my story became clear to me. All my life, I had defined my worth by the men. I was Thomas Torres's disappointing daughter, then I was Derek Whitmore's brilliant wife. I had been so busy trying to live up to their expectations, to survive their manipulations, that I never stopped to see myself. The great irony is that when I was finally pushed to the absolute need a white knight, need a savior, I saved myself. I used my own mind, my own discipline. The steady hands, the calm under pressure, the methodical need for all the facts before making an incision. I used the skills of Dr. Torres to operate on my own life. I was the surgeon, and I was the patient, and I had survived. My new life is quiet, and it is my own. I find joy in my work, in mentoring young residents at the hospital, in the salty air on my morning run, in the silence of my own home. It wasn't about watching them fall. The real victory wasn't their ruin, but my resurrection. It was the realization that and it was not something a man could take away. Sharing this story has been the final. Speaking these truths out loud, sending them out into the world, it's a way aiming the narrative. It's a comfort to know that my voice can reach beyond the confines of my past. It makes me curious to know how far this story, my story, has traveled. Let me know in the comments what city or even what country you're listening from. It would be nice to see just how far a voice can carry once it's finally